Sawyer, as usual, forgot to do what I asked him to do, but what I asked him to do is to tell about the exciting presentation he made in San Angelo. He had tremendous response. And so Victor Esperandio, that as Bill mentioned now, has followed his footsteps, and I'm sure we'll get a very good response as well. The longer I've known our speaker, the more impressed I am with him. I'm also, like Micah, James Heiser groupie. Doesn't sound very dignified.
Not at your age,
First of all, I doubt there's any Christian leader in America that takes greater concern about our nation's decline, and he was never caught in the grips of political correctness. He's a man of great courage. Several weeks ago, he wrote an article in the New American showing over the history of time that Christians, individuals, and movements did stand up against tyranny, effectively doing so. So let's don't feel sorry for ourselves that we're in such a bad shape today. Anyway, James Heiser is a bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, also pastor of the Salem Lutheran Church in Malone. Prior to entering the ministry, he served as a research associate of the National Center for Public Policy Research in Washington, and also as a media analyst for L. Brett Bozell, many of you remember that name, the Media Research Center in Alexandria, Virginia. He's the author of 6 books, including the new book called The American Empire Should Be Destroyed, subtitled Alexander Dugin and the Perils of Immanentized Eschatology. This is a fascinating subject that you're going to hear about. Likewise, he's written over 400 articles, either in print or online for the New American. You're very privileged to hear a man of great insight and knowledge, Pastor James Heiser.
Thank you. I hope I can live up to such a generous and gracious introduction as that, and I'm very appreciative of this invitation to speak with all of you today. I will apologize for the prepared character of my remarks, which is to say, knowing that preachers have perhaps a little bit of a reputation for speaking at length, I will try to keep my comments within the bounds of the time allowed for us today by sharing them as I've written them down for you. However, with a few points to add to this, when I began my work on Alexander Dugin, he was not a figure who was very well known in Western circles, either academic or popular, and that I've been pleased to see at least that the level of awareness is growing. This is helping in the sense that there is more scholarship that's being done with regard to Dugin's thoughts. It does, however, at the same time have the difficulty that there is more agitation and propaganda in favor of his views, which is transpiring as well. But a rather helpful quotation I came across in an article which was just published here within the last few days cites a passage from Dugin which I had not encountered previously from a 2007 interview for Russian internet television, where Dugin declared concerning the significance of his own thought, "My discourse rules. My ideas rule. Sure, there are wide circles, layers of people between me and the power structures. These people dilute my condensed ideas of Eurasian geopolitics, conservative traditionalism, and other ideals which I defend and develop, to which I dedicate a lot of my work. They create a diluted version of these. Eventually, this version reaches the power structures and they draw upon it as something self-evident, obvious, and easily accessible. That's why I think that Putin is increasingly becoming Dugin." Dugin says concerning himself, but this is his own significance. "At any rate, he pursues a plan that I elaborate, in which I invest my energy my whole life. In the 1990s, my discourse seemed mad, eccentric. Today, our ideas are taken for granted." So far, Dugin, 2007. And this is the significance of Dugin's thought, in that he is giving form and content to the shape of the new ideology which Putin is putting in place. They've gone to great lengths to have Putin not say much of a doctrinal character. That is increasingly coming from the Eurasian circles as the new form of successor to the old Marxist ideology. So let me begin then with a quote from Georgy Arbatov, who was one of the advisors to Mikhail Gorbachev right around the time when the Soviet Union was going through its apparent deconstruction. He said as follows, We're going to do something terrible to you. We're going to take away your enemy. The image of the enemy that is being eroded has been absolutely vital for the foreign and military policy of the U.S. and its allies. The destruction of this stereotype is Gorbachev's secret weapon. So far, Arbatov. A brief quip by President Obama during the 2012 presidential debate with Governor Romney has gotten a little bit more attention of late, and maybe even some respect, after Putin first seized control of one portion of Ukraine, Crimea, and then began to overtly destabilize several regions of eastern Ukraine. Obama said to Romney during their foreign policy debate, "Governor Romney, I'm glad that you recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat, because a few months ago when you were asked what the biggest geopolitical threat facing America was, you said Russia, not al-Qaeda. You said Russia. In the 1980s, they're now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because, you know, the Cold War has been over for 20 years. Now, this has obviously gotten a little bit of favorable attention for Romney. What very few people have asked is, which foreign policy of the 1980s? And in which particular policy direction toward Russia are they referring to? In the first term of the Reagan administration, it was often popularly believed, and a case could have been made for there being some measure of containment of that which Reagan publicly referred to as the evil empire. However, in the second term, and during the presidencies then of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, American foreign policy assumed certainly a different mean, which operated from the assumption that the purported reforms which Soviet President Gorbachev had carried out as part of perestroika somehow had signaled a fundamental capitulation on the part of the Soviet Union. In 1984, a controversial book was published which captured the attention of both casual and professional observers of Soviet foreign policy. In his first book, New Lies for Old, Anatoly Golitsyn, a former senior analyst for the KGB, set forth his understanding of Soviet strategy based on his intimate knowledge both of the tactics and long-term strategy of the USSR, which had been developed in 1959 and 1960. Golitsyn understood the strategic aims of the Soviet Union because he played a role in crafting them, even though he had inwardly become increasingly opposed to the Soviet aim of world domination since, by his testimony, when he had witnessed the suppression of the revolt in Hungary in 1956. Golitsyn defected at the end of 1961, and he spent the next several decades endeavoring to educate Western intelligence agencies concerning the character of the new strategy. In his book, New Lies for Old, Golitsyn explained that he had labored for 20 years in the effort to explain the duplicitous character of Soviet policy. In his assessment, the West has misunderstood the nature of changes in the communist world and has been misled and outmaneuvered by communist guile. Golitsyn's hypothesis was that the supposed division within the communist world and the testimony of prominent dissidents, such as Andrei Sakharov and many of the so-called defectors, whom Golitsyn claimed were still part of the service of the KGB, was part of an elaborate ruse by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the KGB, and that this ruse had been largely successful in swaying the opinions of Western politicians and scholars. In Golitsyn's words, which I will quote at length, "This is not because they have consciously played down the threat. It is due to a genuine and to some extent excusable lack of understanding. They accept at face value what the communists choose for them to see and hear. They accept the existence of communist tactical disinformation in the form of covert political actions and forgeries of Western government documents, but fail to appreciate the problem of strategic disinformation in the shape of communist forgeries of differences, splits, and independence in the communist bloc. Tactical forms of disinformation are intended to divert attention from the onset of the communist offensive in the final phase of policy. Strategic disinformation is a root cause of the current crisis in Western foreign policy." End quote. Golitsyn called for diplomatic disengagement from the communist world. He said détente discussions, SALT negotiations, and communist proposals for European collective security should be broken off or declined. When Golitsyn's second book, entitled The Perestroika Deception, was published in 1995, his tone was more insistent. The volume consisted of various memoranda which the author had prepared for the CIA between 1975 and 1995, in which he had predicted that the period of reform, the toleration of dissident movements, and even the apparent collapse of the communist regimes in the Warsaw Pact and USSR would be part of a carefully planned ruse. Again, he declared, it was not in 1985 but in 1958 that the communist leaders recognized after the Hungarian and Polish revolts that the Stalinist practice of mass repression had severely damaged the system and that radical measures were necessary to restore it. It was then that they decided to transform the Stalinist system into a more attractive form of communist democracy. It was then that the communist leaders realized that communism could not be spread abroad against a background of fear and mass repression, and that world communist victory could only be achieved by transforming the Soviet and other communist regimes into a form more attractive to the West. End quote. In this context, the entirety of the supposed reforms undertaken first by Gorbachev and then by Yeltsin could be reinterpreted as part of an elaborate scheme. In short, if Golitsyn's argument is correct, perestroika and its aftermath were part of possibly the most elaborate tactical withdrawal in recorded history. In '94, Mark Riebling wrote in his book The Wedge, The Secret War Between the FBI and CIA, that Golitsyn's insights had largely, although neglected, proven true. I'll spare you the long citation where he goes into great detail about the nature of the manuscript, but the point that he sets forth then is Golitsyn provides an entire chapter of predictions based on his understanding of the Soviet approach, containing 194 distinct auguries. Of these, 46 were not soon falsifiable. Another 9 predictions seemed clearly wrong. Yet of Golitsyn's falsifiable predictions, 139 out of 148 were fulfilled by the end of 1993, an accuracy rate of nearly 94%. And mind you, these were very specific predictions, not of a loose nature, and included such specificity as, for example, that the Berlin Wall would come down, which in 1984 almost no one was saying. Golitsyn had to actually seek permission from the CIA for the publication of both of his manuscripts, which they then in turn granted. As Riebling observes, Golitsyn's hypothesis concerning the perestroika deception proved to be highly accurate regarding those events which he anticipated in his first book. But what can be said of the overall theory? More directly, did the communist conspiracy and the primary organ of that conspiracy, the KGB, survive the enactment of its tactical withdrawal? Or did it die somewhere along the way, replaced by the petty despotism of Vladimir Putin, who just happens to be a former KGB agent? When I begin an assessment of this central question with an examination of the rise of what is now called Neo-Eurasianism, or just Eurasianism, it's getting classified in the media these days, and Putin's forthcoming Eurasian Union. And to understand Eurasianism, we need to understand the life and thought of its primary proponent, Alexander Galeevich Dugin. Time does not permit a detailed examination of every aspect of the life of Dugin, but some brief survey is necessary for an evaluation of his thought. He was born in Moscow in 1962 and is the son, grandson, and great-grandson of military officers. In fact, it is purported that Dugin's own father was a GRU, a military intelligence officer. However, Dugin's own path did not lead him to military service. According to Stephen Shenfield's book, Russian Fascism, Dugin, quote, depressed and alienated from the secret Soviet reality around him, he encountered by chance, through a neighbor of his parents, a secretive group of intellectuals who gave him the existential home he sought, end quote. Thus, by the time he was 18 years old, Dugin had joined a secret society in Moscow known as the Yuzhinsky Circle, organized around 2 teachers of occultism, Yuri Mamliev and Evgeny Golovin. Members of the Yuzhinsky Circle seem to have been obsessed with a strange amalgam of mysticism and fascination with fascism and Nazism. In the words of Anton Chekhov, who has written extensively on Dugin's ideology, quote, in this circle, Golovin was progressively propagating occultism, esotericism, the integral traditional works of René Guénon and other authors, and later conservative revolutionary and fascist classics, end quote. Dugin quickly demonstrated his intelligence and commitment to the aims of the group, and within a year had translated the book entitled Pagan Imperialism, which is one of the spiritual works of the so-called spiritual fascist Julius Evola. According to Dugin, the occultism of the Yuzhinsky Circle was formative to his entire worldview, including the variation of Eurasianist ideology of which he was the author. As Dugin declared in a 2006 interview, quote, my intellectual formation happened in 1979 and 1980 when becoming acquainted with the traditionalists of the Third Way, those like Edward Golovin and Gedar Jamal. Therefore, my formation as a personality, as an intellectual, as a thinker, as a politician, as an ideologue was exactly traditionalistic. The only thing that could fill this gigantic inner emptiness which I had was the total rejection of everything modern within the framework of the ultra-revolutionary, nonconformist intellectualism of Guénon and Evola. That is how I was formed. In 1981, 1982, I was already a full-fledged philosopher with my own intellectual agenda, with my own metaphysic and ideology. I did not mature anymore, end quote. A legend in his own mind. So-called traditionalism, especially as it is set forth in the writings of Julius Evola, seeks to bring about the spiritual transformation of society through political action. And the desired spiritual transformation is supposedly the restoration of primordial tradition which antedates all known religions. In other words, it sets itself forth as the religion over all religions. Traditionalists declare modernity to be, in fact, not just what we would call the modern age, but all of recorded history. Thus, when encounters in Dugin, Evola, Guénon, and other so-called traditionalists writing about the roots of the evil of the modern age in the bizarre terms of a tension between the doctrines of Hyperborea and Atlantis. I mean, it's that kind of nutty, which makes it all the more difficult the longer you read in Dugin to keep coming back and saying, and this man is taken seriously. Why? When people start talking about Atlantis and Hyperborea, normally you just sort of politely excuse yourself from the conversation. Not so with Alexander Dugin. It is alleged that his occult activities brought him into grief in the Soviet era. He was purportedly expelled from the Moscow Institute of Aviation in 1983 after an arrest by the KGB. What happened after his expulsion is a matter of different accounts, with some writers claiming that he worked as a street sweeper after his expulsion, continuing his studies of the occult in the Lenin Library with a forged reader's card. While another biography of Dugin, and I quote, says that after his expulsion from the Aviation Institute, he started working in a KGB archive, where he gained access to and read large amounts of forbidden literature on Masonry, fascism, and paganism, end quote. So was he a street sweeper? Was he working for the KGB? For those of us who have studied that period, it can very easily be all of the above if his purpose was to serve as an agent of influence within the Yuzhinsky circle and beyond, which I think is at least a possibility which needs to be seriously considered. Between 1987 and 89, he rose quickly within the ranks of the neo-fascist anti-Semitic Pomyat movement, where he quickly joined the ranks of its Central Council in 1988 and 1989. According to Sheketsov, Dugin joined Pomyat and tried to change its course to that of traditionalism as he saw it, just as Evola had once tried to shape the course of Italian fascism. It's worth noting that Dugin's affiliation with Pomyat did not lead to further difficulties with Soviet authorities because, in the words of one scholar, quote, support for Pomyat came from highly placed individuals in the Central Committee, the KGB, and the armed forces. There was more assistance on the regional level, end quote. This is of profound significance in terms of the support given to Pomyat by such Soviet operichniki, because Golitsyn asserted that by the 1980s, there were no genuine popular movements arising in the Soviet Union. Rather, they were all in the service of the regime. In Golitsyn's words, quote, by the 1980s, there were no social democrats or politically active nationalists left alive in the USSR. By then, the KGB and party apparatus had succeeded in creating conditions in which only they could form strong grassroots organizations, end quote. This is significant because Pomyat was precisely such a so-called nationalist group, which according to Golitsyn would have then been a creation of the KGB, in which Dugin was almost immediately, as a young man, placed in the Central Committee. In his 2005 book, The Extreme Nationalist Threat in Russia, Thomas Parland declared concerning the emergence of Russian nationalist groups in the 60s and 70s, quote, people professing liberal and democratic ideas were repressed without mercy and sent to labor camps or mental hospitals, whereas right-wing nationalists, in most cases, got off without a scratch, end quote. If such developments are viewed in light of Golitsyn's hypothesis, this would simply signal that the creation of such popular groups was simply, but secretly, the policy of the party and the KGB. His relationship with Pomyat came to an end for Dugin when the leader of the organization dismissed him in the delightful term of expression here as a quote-unquote kike mason. He then landed without a scratch, starting what he called his Arctogaia publishing house, which became, and I quote, a Russian node of the broad European New Right network. end quote. In fact, and seemingly inexplicably, this humble street sweeper went on a tour then in 1989 and 90 of Western Europe, following his departure from the ranks of Pamjat, establishing influential ties with the most important of the hard right and neo-fascist thinkers, if you can call them such, in Western Europe. John Dunlop, who has done some work with Eurasianism, noted in 2004, and I quote, "In 1989, taking advantage of increased opportunities to visit the West, Dugin spent most of the year traveling to Western European countries. While there, he strengthened ties with leading figures of the European New Right, such as Frenchman Alain de Benoist and Belgian Jean-François Thiriart. These contacts led to Dugin's words, belated reconciliation with the USSR, just as that state was approaching its final demise." End quote from Dunlap. So just so you understand what happened, the guy who's supposed to be a street sweeper goes on a year-long vacation before the fall of the Soviet Union, meeting with neo-fascist thinkers all over Western Europe. They make time for him. In fact, one of them, Claudio Muti, arranges for the publication of Dugin's first book in Italy. And that it's during all of his meetings with the European so-called New Right that he has his reconciliation with Soviet doctrine. The French Nouvelle Droite, which is notably a neo-pagan, anti-Christian in its orientation, appears to have been significantly influenced by traditionalism. And so the connection was at least in part based on a common set of theological principles. But it's noteworthy that Dugin was, again, reconciled to the Soviet regime precisely during the year in which the street sweeper traveled the West. Dugin spent much of the time between his European adventures and the formation of the National Bolshevik Party in 1993, of which he was the chief intellect, in efforts to publish a series of books setting forth his mystical theology and his political views. Today, he claims to be the author of 40 separate books. Even for a Russian, that's long-winded. In the effort to set forth the relationship between the different parts of his thought. Thus, for example, his mystical work entitled Paths of the Absolute was published in 1990, and the delightfully titled Conspirology, the Science of Conspiracies, Secret Societies, and Occult War was published in 1993, and the book The Hyperborean Theory, an Ariosophical Investigation was again published in 93. However, it was also during these interim years that Dugin influenced Gennady Zhuganov, who was then, and I believe is still to this day, the leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is a relatively smaller party in terms of its representation within the Duma, but nonetheless significant. And then also he had an influence on Vladimir Zhirinovsky of the ironically misnamed Liberal Democratic Party, for those of you that know anything about Zhirinovsky's thought. And that he was a direct influence on Zhirinovsky in terms of development of Eurasianist thinking in the Liberal Democratic Party. Also during this time period, Dugin's new friends in the Nouvelle Droite and elsewhere in Western Europe reciprocated on the visit, and thus in '92, Alain de Benoist and Robert Strickers visited Moscow on Dugin's invitation to take part in a panel discussion at the office of the supposedly right-wing but Soviet nostalgic. I mean, these terms right and left don't mean anything. Look where they align. The right-wing Soviet nostalgic newspaper, Den, or Day, for which Dugin worked as a journalist. This was the beginning of the so-called Red-Brown Alliance in post-Soviet Russia between purported neo-fascists and neo-Stalinists. They were all working together because the labels don't matter. Parland in his book notes that Zhuganov's Communist Party adopted the most essential parts of neo-Eurasianism as its new ideology during this time period. And Zhirinovsky's Eurasianism gained infamy in the West, at least for a while in the mid-90s, when he advocated a Russian, in his words, last bid for the South, which would involve Russia conquering its way to the Indian Ocean. And I quote briefly from Zhirinovsky. America, the only country that could oppose us, will step back, for it holds its own fate dear, and unlike Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey, it will not lose its ability to live. Russia has nothing to lose. We will go down to the south as liberators to put a stop to violence. We will go where people surrounded by blood wake up and go to sleep to the sound of bullets and explosions, where they live amid violence and looting. Where is this? Russian soldiers will stop this butchery, this violence, this outrage to human culture, and Russian soldiers will themselves come to a stop on the shore of the warm Indian Ocean, establishing their new outposts, settlements, resorts, and sentries. With floodlights, Russian soldiers will illuminate the frontier waters of the Indian Ocean. End quote. Zhirinovsky's blustering gained attention, as I said, for a while in the mid-90s before it seemingly blew over when Russia did not immediately go on the march. And it is not uncommon for Putin to use Zhirinovsky as one who floats trial balloons, softening Western opinion, or at least desensitizing us to this extremism, when then Putin comes along and says similar things, but without quite the same degree of vitriol. And in '99, it was Zhirinovsky who was responsible for Dugin becoming chairman of the geopolitical section of the Duma's advisory council, their parliament's council, on national security. At the same time that Dugin was influencing Zhirinovsky, he was also wooing Edward Limonov away from the Liberal Democratic Party to help found the National Bolshevik Party. Limonov readily acknowledged Dugin to be the source of the ideological substance of the NBP, declaring Dugin to be, quote, the Cyril and Methodius of fascism, since he brought faith and knowledge about it to our country from the West, end quote. In the metaphysics of National Bolshevism, we begin work written by Dugin, we begin to get the shape of the new Eurasianist ideology. Dugin writes, the most felicitous and full definition of National Bolshevism will be as follows. National Bolshevism is a super ideology common to all open society enemies. Not just one of the hostile to such ideologies, but is exactly its full, conscious, total, and natural antithesis. The National Bolshevism is a kind of an ideology which is built on full and radical denial of the individual and his central role. Also, the absolute in which name the individual is denied has the most extended and common sense. Dugin conceived of his ideology as the successor not only to Nazism and Marxism, and states it in those terms, but as the perfect unity of all anti-Western, anti-modern ideologies, and requires a mystical version of its antecedent ideologies. Thus, Dugin sets forth the new Marxism, Marxism 2.0, the mystical Marxism. In Dugin's words, it is this Gnostic tendency of Marx and his predecessors was applied by the Russian Bolsheviks who were raised up in an environment where the enigmatic forces of Russian sectarian groups, mysticism, national messianism, secret societies, and passionate romantic character of Russian rebels were being summoned against the alienated, temporal, degraded monarchic regime. Moscow, Third Rome, Russian people as the God carrier, the nation of the all-man. Russia is destined to rescue the world. All these ideas impregnated Russian life, which had it in common with the esoterical plots incorporated in Marxism. The National Bolshevism takes turn of just such Bolshevik tradition, the policy of right communism, which was originated by the ancient initiatic societies and spiritual doctrines in remote ages. For Dugin, the call, end of quote. Dugin calls for National Bolshevism to supplant all loyalties to previous versions of the communist ideology. He says, and I quote, beyond rights and lefts, there's one and indivisible revolution. In the dialectical triad, Third Rome, Third Reich, Third International. The realm of National Bolshevism, Regnum, their empire of the end. This is the perfect accomplishment of the greatest revolution in history, both continental and universal. It is the angel's return, hero's resurrection, the heart's uprising against the reason's dictatorship. This last revolution is a concern of the acephalous, the headless bearer of the cross, sickle and hammer, crowned by eternal sun swastika, end quote. In Dugin's system, a far more expansive attack on the West is proposed than was set forth by Marxism-Leninism, because it is a system which is able to incorporate traditional Russian messianic mysticism within itself. When Dugin had completed his National Bolshevik doctrine, he wrote his work entitled Foundation of Geopolitics, which was published in 1997, quickly went through 4 editions between 1997 and 2000, and which was officially sponsored by General Igor Rodionov, who was then Minister of Defense for the Republic of Russia. This volume was widely used as a textbook in Russian military colleges and became one of the most widely discussed volumes in the circles of the powerful in Moscow. So Dugin's mystical rants and discussions of Hyperborea were no impediment to his influence, and he quickly became an advisor to Gennady Seleznev, the chairman of the Duma, and became the chairman of the Duma's Advisory Committee on National Security. at the very time when his textbook on geopolitics was being adopted in Russian leadership circles. There's a reason why Dugin in 2007 would say, "They're all my ideas." It was just impolitic of him to observe such. Dugin left the National Bolshevik Party in '98, quickly completing the academic credentials for the next phase of his operations as a faculty member of Moscow State University. Thus, when Putin suddenly rose from obscurity to become president of the Russian Federation in 2000, Dugin was in position. In April 2001, Dugin formed Evrazia, the Eurasian movement. Prior to 2001, Dugin, according to various sources, had a known support base of 50 named individuals in Moscow. But suddenly Evrazia was organized with 59 branches and more than 10,000 members dispersed throughout Russia. Marlene Laruelle, who is one of the experts on the history of Eurasianism, noted that, quote, during its founding convention, Evrazia, often described as a brainchild of presidential counsel Gleb Pavlovsky, who is close to Dugin, officially rallied to Putin and proposed to participate in the next elections as part of the government coalition, end quote. Dugin's support for Putin was unconditional. Speaking to the political council of Evrazia in 2001, Dugin insisted that, quote, true Eurasianism can only be achieved via Putin. What stands against Putin is pseudo-Eurasianism, end quote. In his book about post-Soviet Russia entitled, "It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway," David Satter observes, quote, with the accession of Putin, the search for a new national idea became more focused. Now understand, they hadn't lost their idea. What they were waiting for was its unfolding. But Satter continues, but post-Soviet Russian society was not in a condition to base itself on the values that communism had destroyed. Instead, the new attempts at a national idea bore an eerie resemblance to the Marxism-Leninism that Russians had so recently left behind. One such attempt was the theory of Eurasianism, which posited a mortal opposition between a united Eurasia and transatlantic West. According to the Eurasianist platform, Eurasiasts and Atlantists defend two different, alternative, mutually excluding images of the world and its future. It is the opposition between the Eurasiasts and Atlanticists which defines the historical outline of the 21st century, end quote. Dugin declares in his work entitled Main Principles of Eurasianism that, quote, the integration of CIS countries into a unified Eurasian union is the major strategic imperative of Eurasianism. Now, he wrote that years before Putin declared they were going to create a Eurasian union. The Commonwealth of Independent States is what he's referring to. This is what came into being after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It includes Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Turkmenistan is an unofficial associate member. Georgia, although it was once a member, has withdrawn from the CIS. Ukraine's already tenuous connection to the CIS moved toward an open breach after the seizure of Crimea. Dugin declared that the integration of all of these states into the Eurasian Union is a quote-unquote strategic imperative. Thus, one can see why the Putin regime is unwilling to stop its aggression toward Ukraine. It has been widely stated the Eurasian Union is meaningless without it. So the tragedy for the Ukrainian people is precisely as was discussed before in the context of Art's very insightful essay on the nature of what's going on in our time, is that the Ukrainian people find themselves trapped between the choice of a European Union or a Eurasian Union. You know, what Ukrainians need is Ukraine. Nothing more, nothing less, and to be left to pursue their own destiny. They don't need to be part of anyone's bloc, as it were. But it's not just the CIS states, it's not just Ukraine that Dugin sets his sights on. Again, as Dugin sets forth in the Main Principles of Eurasianism, the Eurasianist ideology is set in the path of reshaping the entire international order. He decrees that China, Pakistan, and the Arab countries are to be, in his words, neutralized, lest they become allies of the West. As for the rest of the Third World, it is to be divided as spoils of war among the various allied peoples of the Eurasian Empire. Quote, concerning these countries, Russia should follow differentiated policies, contributing to their political integration in zones of common prosperity under the control of the mighty partners of Russia within the Eurasian bloc, end quote. And for Dugin, the Eurasianist battle against the West means bringing the battle to the West. for those portions of the world which he describes as, and I quote, the U.S. and the countries of the American continent laying under U.S. control, end quote, Dugin also promises more warfare, and I quote at length. Rigidly and actively using to this purpose, first of all, the instrument of the Eurasian alliance, opposing such globalization, Russia should, on the contrary, support the isolationist tendency in the U.S., saluting with favor the limitation of U.S. geopolitical interests to the American continent. And if unipolar globalization will keep being staged, it is Russia's interest to back the anti-American mood in Southern and Central America, using, however, a more flexible and wider worldview and geopolitical device than Marxism. In the same channel lays the policy of priority work with anti-American political circles in Canada and Mexico, possibly also using in this direction the lobbyist activity of the Eurasian diasporas in the U.S., end quote. More needs to be said about the details of the Eurasian doctrine. That's kind of part of why I wrote the book. It's impossible to set forth all the details of the ideology in this context. What matters is its scope and the fact that this has been now adopted in one form or another as Russian policy overtly. Eurasianism is intended first to reunite the countries of the CIS, then, in Dugin's words, to eventually spread from Dublin to Vladivostok. That's what he sets as the confines of Eurasia. Thus, Marxism 2.0, which he now calls not National Bolshevism, but the fourth political theory, and it's also the title of a recent book by Dugin, was formulated even as a KGB agent was solidifying his unchallengeable reign over Russia. For years, academic opinion marginalized Dugin's thought, even as Western liberals marveled over its expansive extremism. I mean, it's actually, in a sick way, kind of humorous to read the Russian foreign policy textbooks of the early 2000s because they keep marveling, how can this fellow be rising in prominence? How can he be taken seriously? And don't worry because there won't be a Eurasian Union. No one will actually act on this at the end of the day. Until in late 2011, Putin came out and announced that there would be the formation of the Eurasian Union and that the current customs union is now officially set on January 1st of next year to become the Eurasian Union. At this point, the only signatory states that are presently committed to it are Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. Ukraine is, by most estimates, necessary to its economic and political strength if it's to be a counterbalance to the European Union. Once again, going to the Orwellian aspect of power blocks that seem to oppose, and yet their basic purpose is the sharing of authority and not genuine opposition. The West's incredulity at the thought of Dugin paralleled its reaction to the actions of Putin, who used bombings in Moscow to justify an attack on Chechnya, violated post-Cold War treaties guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Georgia and Ukraine, and orchestrating the murder of his opponents both at home and abroad, even indulging in the gruesome theater of murdering a former FSB agent with polonium, a clear signal to the entire world that the Russian government was responsible. Western academics dismissed Dugin's proposed Eurasian Union as a fantasy right up until the moment that Putin formally announced it. Since then, many of those same academics have tried to insist that what Dugin and Putin intend for the Eurasian Union are two very separate things. I believe that when viewed through the lens of the Golitsyn hypothesis, a very different picture comes to light. What we behold is the simultaneous rise of the ideologue in Dugin and the leader in Putin, the man who exercises might and the ideology which supports his claim to empire. The ideologue and the leader have set their sights for the moment on various European stratagems. Why should the West care? Because it's not the last of the capitals which they intend to incorporate into the Eurasian Union. In the words of Alexander Dugin from his essay entitled "The Hand is Stretching for the Holster," and I'll close with this quote, "Two positions which could not be brought together, two all-encompassing super world views, two mutually exclusive projects of the future of mankind. Between them is only enmity, hatred, brutal struggle according to rules and without rules, for extermination to the last drop of blood. Between them are heaps of corpses, millions of lives, endless centuries of suffering and heroic deeds. This will be decided by war, the father of all things." End quote. a depressing outlook, perhaps, but one which I think we need to be aware of as that ideology begins to take its form in the coming years. Thank you for your attention. I'll take some questions if we have time.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
What about the purported influence of Solzhenitsyn upon Putin? And how would you compare Solzhenitsyn and...
I would glad to comment on that. One of the things which the Dugin circles have been trying to do in recent months is precisely try to steal Solzhenitsyn's mantle posthumously. At the time, for example, they love running the picture of Putin on behalf of the Russian government presenting an award to Solzhenitsyn. At that time, in I believe it was late 2007, Solzhenitsyn explicitly stated that he was not receiving this from Putin, but from the board which had given this award to him. And he had previously refused awards which had come from would have come from Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Because he didn't want to be politically manipulated. So instead what they've done is crassly use the image now. Solzhenitsyn was someone who was adamantly opposed to Pamyat and also to National Bolshevism, did so explicitly. There are quotations which I don't have with me here, so I won't try to paraphrase them more than simply to say he was publicly opposed to these as movements that were arising during the last days of his life. And their attempt now to posthumously bring him in, what they end up doing is taking his Russian nationalist quotations out of context as if he were favoring some sort of expansionist agenda. Solzhenitsyn was a Russian patriot and never lost his love for his own people. But he never confused that with a love for the Soviet Union in any means, and certainly didn't favor seeing the Russian people used as means of exploitation again. Yeah, follow up.
One other question I have is how do you get from René Guénon to collectivism? That's kind of
Yeah, and I think that the stronger tie is through Guénon's most important student, which was Julius Evola. Without getting into the real deep waters here of traditionalist theology, there is a bit of a division between the followers of René Guénon and Julius Evola, where for Guénon it was primarily an inner spiritual transformation which then incidentally transformed society, whereas for Julius Evola it was a matter of we change the society so that men will be changed. One of Evola's books, just to kind of put him on the spectrum, that he wrote after the Second World War was entitled Fascism Viewed from the Right. And he was one of the few fascist ideologists actually not to be imprisoned after the war, because it was demonstrated that his views were so extreme that they really didn't think that they had much of an influence on Mussolini. And so he continued to live and write and influence until his death in 1974. A lot of his writing is filled with a glorification of war for war's sake and the suppression of the bourgeois, Jewishly influenced Christian religion, as these things tend to get dismissed. Christianity is too cosmopolitan, it's too soft, it's too decadent. What we need is words like virility occur a lot in Evola's writing. We use a strong, virile, pagan rebuttal of the weakness of the modern age. And so that's how you get that connection there. Yeah, if anybody else has a question first. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Bishop, is Francis part of the doctrine?
Oh, yes.
Somehow I get the idea that the discussion, I see Francis part of the doctrine shades of the Antichrist.
Yes, as a significant influence on the European New Rights. Yes. And that you have this kind of cross-fertilization that continues to go on. For example, one of Dugin's most recent books, picking up the Heideggerian thoughts of the Nouvelle Droits, when the title is literally just translated into English, Martin Heidegger, The Last God, is the one of the most recent titles that he came out with. So that of course makes Elaine de Benoist very happy, among others. Yes, sir.
There's like competing guys that want to be legends in their own mind.
Yeah.
Asian Empire, you probably know Turkey and some of these
Yeah.
Soviet sphere of influence, Turkey linguistic kind of
Mhm.
it's all the way out into the Central Asia. But they've got this kind of version of the new Ottoman Empire going that way, but
Yeah.
secular or whatever. And they can't all be right.
No.
Necessarily, they're getting, they think we're into ourselves when they come up with the other guys. And I'm wondering what maybe real limits on this kind of legends in their own mind thing might actually exist because of that. And also just because of the spread of technology, which is a little more than sort of critique and release of it. I mean, you can call someone right now in Russia, phone call them,
Right.
contact them on the internet, okay? These guys are even posting their postings in English to have a wide audience. And that would seem to go against the notion that, oh yeah, they're gonna be able to, keep the lid on things on the Pandora's box that's open, was the fall of Gorbachev. And I find that a little bit attractive, although clearly there's people like you that want to recreate the empire.
Yes.
They seem a little to me like, you mentioned virility and all that, the kind of quote men unquote that beat their wives, they're all talking about virility too and everything, but it's coming from their own frustration, sometimes
Sure.
literal sexual impotence or economic impotence at getting a job, and they're, oh, but I'm tough, I'm the ruler of this little
Yeah.
household.
What-
That seems to me that's what's kind of going on with
Well-
Putin. It's a joke. It's-
What I would say is, in brief reaction to that, is while there are many who will try to posit power, Putin actually has the capacity for might and has already demonstrated propensity to invade neighboring countries. I'm not interested in a long debate about the significance of access to the Russian media and so forth. The simple truth of it is we've seen a growing collectivization of media outlets in Russia in recent years. And that, for example, you do not get on television without being favored by the state. And so one of the most dangerous things you can have, extrapolating from, in a certain sense, our own circumstances, there are a few things more dangerous than a media which is perceived to be free. We have immeasurably more access here, and yet we are very conscious, certainly everyone in this room, of how difficult it is to get the truth out. Okay, now you have a country with a history of collectivism and where there is not that same access to media. And so what is hypothetically possible versus what actually happens are very different things. And anyone who writes on this topic finds that you very quickly get troll attacks in this regard. I want to take at least one from this side of the room. Yeah.
Can you repeat the
Yeah,
question?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the error. Yeah. I think that one of the difficulties is often opposition groups which appear to arise are in point of fact used by the regime as a means of letting off pressure. And so you will have circumstances where I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the emergence of protest groups and websites and so forth whose the job of the organizations is to take the heat off of the leader by, in essence, distracting and distorting. This is one of the points that Golitsyn would make with regard to Sakharov, for example, was he maintained to the grave that Sakharov was not a dissident, but was in fact being utilized by the regime, either knowingly or unknowingly, as the guiding and channeling the official line of dissent in one direction or another. I would dare to say, again, by the danger of analogy, how often do we see opposite opinions to those of the government expressed by people who are basically false flag? They come out and say, the argument against thus and such situation is this, and that all legitimate people will agree with this line of argumentation. Your thought is illegitimate if you don't subscribe to the official opposition. And that's, I don't know whether we might see perhaps a genuine movement arise. What I would be very careful of is if we see opposition emerge to look very carefully at what they're saying and whether it's something that actually leads, to a reduction in the danger or something which, in point of fact, actually accentuates it. One more question from this side, and then I'll come over.
In your studies of Russia and Ukraine,
Yes.
have you studied who controls the elections and how they do? And the reason why I'm asking this is because it appears to me that in the phony collapse of communism, they kept certain controls in the police and probably also in the elections. I don't have any details of it, but I'm wondering if you have studied that into whether or not they can make sure that the rascals never really get thrown out, and when they're ready to come back in, they'll be able to control it.
Well, thank you for your question. I would not by any means set myself forth as an expert on Ukraine, but from what I do know with regard to their electoral situation and continuity of government, let me just point out a couple of points in passing. I think that you're all aware of the Maidan protests of last year and through the basically beginning of spring this year. Ukrainian state security has now been largely held responsible for the massacre of 53 people at the conclusion of those protests through what was called their Alpha Team, their counterterrorism group, that the outgoing leader used that as a means, allegedly, of keeping the protests tied up while he got out of the country. Ukrainian Secret Service, the Security Bureau, was regularly cross-trained with the FSB, the successor to the KGB. And so, the degree to which you have, the former KGB in Russia and the, in essence, former KGB extension in Ukraine as, personnel who are very friendly with one another, means that a lot of the really most interesting things that are going on that would be part of a great answer to your question are unknowable to us. What we do know, as Art Thompson pointed out, is that the people of prominence in Ukrainian politics are, in the main, former Soviets, and that this is a similar situation throughout other areas of the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And so, again, it's difficult to speculate what might be possible popularly or not. What you do see is that where there have been what appear to be genuine popular movements, for example, the Donbass Battalion, which was made up out of Maidan protesters, they have repeatedly complained about Poroshenko cutting off access to the weapons that they need and abandoning them. They were among those who were recently abandoned behind enemy lines. And when Putin swore that his little friends in the Donetsk People's Republic would allow the Donbass Battalion to withdraw if they were disarmed, they put down their arms, they went into the green corridor where they were promised safe conduct, and they were gunned down. Apparently as many as 100 were simply killed outright. It received almost no Western press attention because, in my opinion, it's Donbass Battalion. These guys are basically a state-authorized militia of the very band of troublemakers who were used to bring down the former governments. I think that probably those were men of integrity and an intention to a genuine change in Ukraine. What ended up happening was they were gunned down, and that tends to be what happens to genuine dissident movements. Is you can tell it post-mortem who was real and who wasn't by which ones end up in the camps or shot in the head or have various other betrayals that befall them. The official opposition survives over and over again, like Dugin did with Pamyat, etc. The impermissible opposition gets gunned down in green corridors.
I guess you're saying that, but the question was, who controls the elections? I guess what you're saying is that that's a secret.
But we don't, because then you have to get into the question of who controls the balloting places, etc. And those tend to be many of the same people that have always controlled them. It's not like you had the whole government of the country change from top to bottom. The people who were the election monitors last time, when Yanukovych went in, are the same ones who are there when Poroshenko goes in, and will be there whenever something else happens. And so I think there's not really transparency we want in that regard.
Let's take one last question. Let's take one last question.
Yeah, you had a question there.
Oh, well, I'm not a philosopher. used the term messianic mystic.
Yeah. By messianism, in other words, the Russian belief that their country has a salvific role in history. They are here to save the world. They used to associate that with the czars. It is mystical in the sense that what you typically find with this train of thought is one which is not connected to a rational process. In other words, it's not something which is deduced by reason, rather it is something which is perceived to simply to be. And so the idea of this messianic mysticism, which is something that goes back as far as the notion that Moscow was the third Rome after Constantinople had fallen, that this was now the new center of all Christianity in the world in the unity of Russian, what we call secular leadership and religious leadership in the Patriarch. This was the last true Christian patriarch and leader that were joined together. That doesn't mean, of course, that Russian messianism always inclines to totalitarianism. Far from it. What it means is that's something that's part of Russian culture, where when you can try to link that as a support basis for the new ideology, the Russian people naturally responded to it. It touches them at the roots of their current age and in their self-consciousness.
Do you have a copy of the book on sale?
Yes, there are copies available, and if you'd like a copy signed, I'd be more than happy to do that. I brought some along, and they're out in the hallway. They're $13. One of the aspects of this I would just mention in passing is it is independent scholarship. That means when I have to buy resources for the research and so forth, that comes out of my pocket, not out of some institution and so forth. And so book purchases help when I'm having to pay $39 for an article, or one textbook alone that might be $100 just to get the book. So if you want to buy the book and learn more about what I've been talking about, I would greatly appreciate that and helps with the research. Thank you.
I'm sure we could have kept him here for an hour asking questions, but we do have a limit to how long we can use the room. Next month, our CEO, Art Thompson, will be addressing. Art's topic will be immigration, and I guarantee you it'll be different than anything you've ever heard on that subject. Thank you so much for coming. See you next month.